I want to thank all of you for coming out on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. And I want to start with a disclaimer, which is that I am not a scientist. I know less than Dr. Science, okay? Dr. Science at least has a degree in science. I don't have any of that. But what I am lacking in scientific expertise, I think I more than make up for with my love for Baba and the things that he taught us and told us, and my curiosity. So I hope that they will fill the gap. Let me get settled here. This is...
Do you need help? Do you need help looking at?
No, I think we're good. Scientists place the age of the universe and the Big Bang at anywhere between 8.4 and 26 billion years. That's a big span there. But the number that resonated with me is that 8.4, because it's the number... No. Why is it not advancing to the next slide?
Because this is here.
Am I supposed to use...
No.
Hang on, I'll just keep talking. The number that resonated with me was that 8.4 billion. That 8.4, where have we heard that big number before? Not billion, but million. Where have we heard that number?
4 lakhs.
Yes.
How many incarnations?
But as I understand, it's 8.4 lakhs in coming up through the kingdoms, 8.4 more lakhs in human form, and another 8.4 in... Let's see what happens here. Yeah, here we go. 8.4 more as we make our way back up through the plains. That's 25 billion lives. When Baba was traveling during the 1920s, during what Lord Mayher calls, thank you, sorry, I don't pay much attention to this stuff. What Lord Mayher called the tumultuous 20s, quote Lord Mayher, an almost nightly game of Parcheesi was played with the mandali, using lines drawn with chalk. The game involved 84 steps, which Baba explained were symbolic of the 84 lakhs of births and deaths necessary before realization, that is, after entering the path. So there you go. And yet, 3 years before, Baba had told Ramju, no time has actually passed during the numberless changes of forms and deaths and births of 84 lakhs, 8,400,000 times, like he just had to really drive that number into him. We'll spend a little more time with the origin of that number, 8.4, in the next meeting, but we're going to leave it just for now. So another number. This number blew my mind. Does anybody recall hearing that number? And in what context? Yeah. Baba told, in what I found as the first recorded reference to it, Baba dictated to Erich in 1946, quote, "A time will come when the best of Mandali's members will give me up. I shall be made to undergo the lowest humiliations by a few persons. 3/4 of the world will then fall at my feet." And 2 years later, after the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi and all the riots and disturbances that followed, he declared, "The future world upheavals, which will result in the loss of 75% of human lives in the world, will render every previous event into insignificance." So, and then he said it again in the final declaration. Would someone like to read that out loud for us? Can you read it from where you are? No?
I'll read it.
Okay.
For the preordained destruction of multiple separateness, which keeps man from experiencing the feelings of unity and brotherhood. This destruction, which will take place very soon, will cause 3/4 of the world to be destroyed. The remaining 1/4 will be brought together to live a life of concord and mutual understanding, thus establishing a feeling of oneness in all fellow beings, leading them toward lasting happiness. Before I break my silence, or immediately after it, 3/4 of the world will be destroyed. I shall speak soon to fulfill all that is shortly to come to pass.
So he repeated that number many, many times, and it's a number that kind of perplexes us because we're thinking, what is it, loss of life? Is it 3/4 of the functioning planet? But when you juxtapose that with the all of the great extinctions, which all involved really profound changes in the earth, I think we're looking at something that's really, really big, and he's serious about it. He was not joking. I first encountered these numbers and fell headlong into the maelstrom of evolution and what Baba said about it while I was watching an amazing 8-part documentary on Netflix, which I told you all about, called Life on Our Planet. Just curious, how many of you have been able to watch it? Good.
I haven't quite finished.
Yeah. Well, we're not really going to talk about it in detail until the next meeting, so you still have a month to catch up with us. And if you do have Netflix, I can't say enough how wonderful it is, and how much I hope you'll learn from it, and will also help prepare you for the next meeting.
Is it life on the planet?
Life on planet Earth. Life on our planet. I can't keep that in my head. I thought it was really extraordinary, and I watched it for the first time in the fall, and immediately those two numbers blew my mind, the 8.4 billion and then the 75%, and I was just like, whoa, and I couldn't stop thinking about them, and all of the things that are kind of peripheral to those numbers. And so in January, I felt compelled to watch it again, and this time I took notes. I took copious notes. I have a 7-page table on 8.5 by 14 paper that I couldn't print out because I forgot to buy the special paper, but I will bring it next time so you can see how much information I was able to pull out of that resource, and also a number of other resources, and we'll look at some of that in the next meeting. So what seemed like a pretty straightforward meeting about Baba and evolution has evolved to 4 meetings, and I probably could do like 4 more if I weren't feeling like I'm going to be exhausted after these are done. I had to limit it. But today what we're going to do is lay the foundation for the following meetings by looking at how the chasm that separates science and religion came about, and why the answers to our questions seem so important to us. Sorry, I have to focus on changing the slides. We'll spend the next 3 subsequent meetings bridging that chasm. In the next meeting, we'll look at what Baba specifically told us about evolution of the plant and animal kingdoms, and we'll see how science mirrors and expands on his explanations. In the 3rd meeting, we'll talk about what Baba has told us about human evolution by looking closely at some of his notes from How It All Happened, the film that never was. And finally, if you've read anything about the lectures that Baba gave the Prem Ashram boys in 1927 and 28, it's chronicled in Ramju's diaries and Creation and Its Causes, and in many other places, you'll know about the love craze that was unleashed among them, because Baba always brought the lesson back to love. And so the last of our meetings, the 4th meeting, we're going to look at love. The love with which Baba has infused his creation, how it functions as the eternal object lesson in his love for us, the wonder it inspires, and how, especially how we employ it in our music and our art and our poetry and our prayers to express our love and gratitude to Baba for having created such a wonderful world. So those are the 4 meetings. Whoops. So I call these the usual suspects. These are among the go-to resources that we use when we're doing this kind of research. Excuse me. There's also, of course, infinite intelligence, which I didn't dare go into because I don't understand it. And I wanted to stick with the explanations Baba gave us that are the easiest ones for us to take in. I leave the complicated stuff to Ward. That's his purview. So who could I get to read this quote, please, and thank you?
In the beginning, there was only the beyond state of God. God had no consciousness of self, but like the slightest ripple on the smooth surface of the ocean, God, the unconscious, had a lahar, a whim of, I want to know myself. On Lord Mayor, page 37 and 46.
I love that quote. When I read it, it just gave me goosebumps because those of us who grew up with the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, you know, where does it start? In the beginning. And I just love that Baba started with that for us because I don't know about the rest of you, but for me, has a very deep sense of connection. In part 2 of God Speaks, Baba wrote that, quote, the infinite, impressionless, unconscious, tranquil state of the soul reverberated with an impulse, which we call the first urge, or the first urge to know itself. He went on to call that first urge the whim. If the first question that Baba posed in the original Whim was, who am I? It seems to me that the questions that naturally follow are, where did I come from, or who made me? They are the most fundamental existential questions of human consciousness, and we've been asking them for 3 million years. They're the foundation of every religious and philosophical movement that has arisen in the millennia of recorded history. But I think they go back to our prehistory, when the first humans looked up and wondered at their place underneath the night sky. The natural response to the question of the original Whim is, I must be the result of something that came before, and that something has evolved into a someone, which of course has evolved into our myriad notions of what we have come to call God. Every ancient culture had its own unique creation myth and worshipped its own god or gods. So this has been with us from the beginning. But as consciousness evolved, so did our ability to observe and discern meaning and patterns in the world around us. And out of those observations, again, emerged religion, and then philosophy, and then science, to address those most fundamental questions. So we seem to be left with 3 choices: swearing on the Bible, evolutionary theory, or the ability to hold both of those, that paradox of science and religion at the same time. And I think that you will find it illuminating as we explore the interplay between science and religion as evolutionary science evolved. I just had to use this when I found it. I mean, Jesus has an earbud, for crying out loud. Whoops. The science of evolution is arguably the culmination of humanity's best material efforts to address the original Whim. The first name that comes to mind for most people, of course, is Charles Darwin. But as much as it seems that his theory on the origin of species emerged from his own explorations and observations fully fledged, if you'll pardon the pun, Darwin stands on the shoulders of a venerable assembly of many other brilliant men going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, Romans, and Persians. Because if evolution is driven by consciousness, as Baba says, then so is our human knowledge growing in tandem with that. And I have a number of examples to follow, but as Baba might have said, these are the least most explanations of an infinitely more complex and fascinating story. Scala naturae, I guess that's how you say it, or literally a ladder or flight of steps of nature, is attributed to Aristotle, who lived more or less midway between Buddha and Jesus, just to give you a point of reference. Aristotle proposed a hierarchy of living things moving from the simplest to humanity, which was deemed most perfect. And this is a medieval illustration of the steps. And you can see the lines point to stones, they point to fire, they point to a tree, a lion, and a human. And then above that are the heavenly realms. And I'm not sure what that building is supposed to represent, if that's, the kingdom of heaven or what, but because I can't read Latin anymore. But that was the first attempt to create a narrative about the evolution of humanity. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi was a Persian polymath whose observations led him to theorize that it was adaptation to their environments that drove the evolution of living things. He was literally a contemporary of Rumi. This is an illustration from a hand-illuminated folio, and the elderly man in the turban is supposed to be al-Tusi, and he's teaching a group of boys reading and writing in a schoolyard. This comes from 1595 Christian era. And meanwhile, Aristotle's ladder inspired the medieval Christian concept of the great chain of being. And I'm sorry that it's not bigger. It postulated a linear line of descent from God down through, get off of here. Oh, you're not going to be able to hear me. Down through a hierarchy of angelic beings to humans, and then down through more or less the same hierarchy that we think of, down through the animals, the fish, birds, plants, and so forth. And at the bottom, you can see the souls burning in hell, just to make the point. One of the things that I love about it is, I don't think you can see it, but in the second line up above the trees, there are a series of animals. One of them is a unicorn. This theory of the great chain of being, which of course was a religious explanation as opposed to the other one, which was a scientific explanation, was the inspiration for a movement called deism, which held that God revealed himself through nature, and the foundation for Western thought, which held that, quote, God is the creator of all things and the model of perfection in all of creation. First cause is the belief that God is responsible for creation, but not the maintenance of the universe, while theism says that God also intervenes in and personally sustains his creation. There won't be a test at the end. Pantheism is the belief that nature is divinity itself and that there is no God outside of it. The Greek word pan means all or everything, and theistic derives from the Greek word theos, meaning God or divinity. It was coined in the 17th century, and even the philosopher Spinoza wrote about pantheism in his book called Ethics. In the East, Taoism, as well as some branches of Vedanta and Buddhism, are thought to be pantheistic. And in 1999, the New World Pantheist movement proposed naturalistic pantheism with reverence for the universe while respecting reason and science. Now that's a pretty good way to look at it, as far as I'm concerned. Meher Baba told James Douglas, who was the editor of the London Sunday Express, in his 1932 interview, quote, "God is both in form and without form." So, in other words, that's different from pantheism. He resides in every being and pervades everything. In every aspect of life, in art, in literature, in beauty, he is. But from all this, you should not take it that I am a pantheist. This is not my opinion. In reality, I know everything from experience. You will understand it all when you know God. The highest experience is to know oneself. It is the supreme experience. It means to be one with God. Transmutation, or transmutation of the species, was an 18th and early 19th century scientific theory that preceded Darwin and informed his work. Also, in 1735, the Swedish naturalist Carolus Linnaeus, I think you probably recognize his name from your high school and college biology classes. He created the modern classification system of the hierarchies of plant and animal life that we still use today. Subsequent discoveries pointed toward a relationship between primates and humans, the descent of all life from a single form, and the spontaneous generation of life that later evolved into more complex forms, as well as the possibilities of adaptation and natural selection, the importance of fossil records, and the discovery of evidence for mass extinctions caused by natural disasters. It was a time of great learning. And if you look at this in the second circle, do you see the buses? Oh, how I wish they were blue. This is the earliest depiction I could find of an image representing a scientific explanation of evolution. It's called The Tree of Life, as depicted by Ernest Haeckel in The Evolution of Man, which he published in 1879. And it illustrates the 19th century view of evolution as a progressive process leading towards humanity. And I know you can't read it from there. I can barely read it here because the printing is so small and it's all in Latin, most of it. But he does a pretty good job of identifying the kingdoms, but then he kind of goes off the deep end. I mean, like sloths have their own little special branch off the tree. And then other branches include like the hoofed animals, you know, it was pretty general. So, but it was his best effort, and for a long time, that's what people had to work with. So enter Charles Darwin, who was born into a wealthy family in Shrewsbury, England in 1809. In 1793, his own grandfather, Erasmus, had proposed that all warm-blooded animals descended from a single form, and he hinted at the as yet unnamed concept of natural selection. Darwin never acknowledged his grandfather's work. He simply appropriated it as his own. And although the family was Anglican, his father was a doctor and was at most a deist, and Darwin had a secular upbringing, so religion was not a big part of his childhood and growing up. In fact, he was expected to read medicine at the University of Edinburgh, where he joined the Plinian Society, quote, a loose-knit body of freethinkers with whom he was exposed to some of the most heretical ideas of the day, end quote. One of his fellow members presented a paper asserting that mind and consciousness were merely the result of brain activity, and it was thought to be so inflammatory that they struck everything about it from the minutes, so nobody would know that the meeting had even taken place. But Darwin found out that he couldn't abide the sight of blood, which is a problem if you're going to be a doctor. So he transferred to Cambridge University, where he was settled in Christ College with the intention of becoming an Anglican vicar, a gentlemanly career option for young men of a certain social strata that was not thought to require an excess of effort or religious commitment, which I thought was really funny. In time, though, he met several scientists who were on the faculty who lectured at Cambridge, and through them he became fascinated with marine life, which we now know to have been some of the first forms of life on the planet. And he switched to the study of natural science, which kind of changed everything. I mean, imagine if he had stuck with being a vicar, a country vicar. Well, there is someone coming up who would have figured it out, but we're not there yet. He graduated in 1831, and it's here that his story becomes very familiar to us. He set sail on the aptly named HMS Beagle, sailing partway down the coast of Africa and then across to South America around Terra del Fuego at the bottom. And then the big red dot, of course, is the Galapagos Islands, where he spent quite a bit of time. And that's the place in the world that we're most likely to associate his name with. In fact, he is said to have dined on tortoises captured on the islands, and he even brought back a few small live specimens to England that, when the Beagle returned in 1836. Darwin brought home a massive collection of notes, drawings, fossils, rocks, shells, and plant and animal specimens that he would use to perfect his theory that the human race, am I where I'm supposed to be? Yes. That the human race was the culmination of a very long series of transformations that ran from the simplest to the most complex. And back home, though, not very many people knew that he was working on this. He was quite a recluse, and only his closest friends knew what he was doing. And they urged him to publish, but he knew he did not have the data to back up his assertion. And so he carried on with his experiments and observations. Further, it was impossible for him to work steadily. He suffered from a series of health issues, including chronic digestive problems, headache, and heart palpitations. And each attack left him weakened for a period of time, and he could not work. It was spotty whether he could continue to work or whether he needed to take time to recuperate. But in 1839, he did manage to publish The Voyage of the Beagle, as well as a notebook of his findings based on the diaries and notes he had kept during the expedition. That same year, Darwin married his first cousin, Emma, and remember that, a daughter of Josiah Wedgwood of the Wedgwood pottery fame. The Wedgwoods were Unitarians with fairly liberal beliefs at the times, but Emma was especially devout. And her husband's respect for her faith, which he did not share, was a factor in his hesitation to pursue his theories. Charles and Emma had 10 children, 7 of whom survived to adulthood, and each Sunday he accompanied his growing family to the door of the nearby country church, where he left them and went for walks in the woods, and then came back just in time to accompany them back home. In 1851, the Darwins' beloved 10-year-old daughter, Annie, died from a fever that they thought was brought on by a trip to the seaside, but it's now been determined that she actually had contracted tuberculosis. Annie's death sent her father into a downward spiral. He became very depressed, and that was intensified by the belief that he thought he was responsible. He became addicted to laudanum, and his relationship with Emma suffered as he drifted further and further away. But what he didn't realize was that she also held herself responsible. And it was his eventual return to his work that lifted him out of the depression. I don't know how many of you have seen this movie. It's on Netflix. It's from 2009 and it's called Creation. And it stars Paul Bettany and Jennifer Connelly. Paul Bettany plays Darwin, and honestly, he looks like Darwin did when he was a young man. And it tells the story of how Darwin reached his conclusions about his theory of evolution through his relationship with Annie and his marriage. It's a very, it's not a scientific movie, in other words. There's a lot of family interactions in it, and it's really wonderful. And I would heartily recommend watching it if you have a chance. Many, if not nearly all of Darwin's so-called discoveries were based on a distillation of much that had come before, but they were bolstered by his associations with other naturalists of the day, as well as by his own travels, breeding experiments, and observations. His intention was to weave together a startling, new, comprehensive theory that no one else contemplated, except for one. This contemporary was a man named Alfred Russel Wallace, and he was as different from Darwin as you can possibly imagine. He was born in 1823, and he only had 8 years of formal education. At the age of 16, I believe, he had to seek employment to help support his siblings and his parents. And his work as a surveyor put him in touch with the natural world, and that sparked his interest in science and drew him into more intellectual pursuits and contacts. Like Darwin, Wallace was drawn to ideas that were kind of at the edge of what was socially acceptable. He was drawn to the radical socialism movement, which declared that, quote, the orthodox religion of the day was degrading and hideous, and that the only true and beneficial religion was that inculcated in the service of humanity and whose only dogma was the brotherhood of man. It sounds pretty good to me. Thus, he wrote, was laid the foundation of my religious skepticism. He abandoned the Old Testament special creation in favor of an old earth conception of change operating through universal laws that had yet to be identified. And in 1848, Wallace embarked on a 4-year expedition to the Amazon River Basin, where exploring places that no one had ever visited before, going pretty far up the river, up the Amazon, and then off onto its tributaries. But on his return journey to England in 1852, his ship, which was carrying a cargo of palm oil and rubber, caught fire and sank, and he barely escaped with his life. The only thing he was able to salvage was a satchel with some of his notes and diaries. He lost his entire collection of specimens. And with the few notes that he had salvaged, he was able to publish a small book and some articles, but he had, without any specimens to back up his findings, his work received very little attention. The following year, he set sail for the Malay archipelago, where he would spend a total of 9 years. And in 1856, while in Borneo, he managed to publish an article in a British journal which contained this pretty remarkable assertion. He said, every species has come into existence coincident both in time and space with a pre-existing, closely allied species. So do you get what he's saying? It's a very fancy way of saying that everything that we find now in time and space came from something closely allied to it in the past. When Darwin was urged to publish his own findings based on this article, Darwin dismissed Wallace's work, either failing to see or just ignoring, quote, the possibility that someone else might be hesitantly circling around before arriving at the same theory. Darwin saw Wallace as an upstart who may have been, quote, and this is Darwin speaking, a seasoned naturalist explorer, but whose philosophy, still inchoate, was at this point little more than idealism befitting of a tradesman educated at a mechanics institute. So, ouch. He described himself as an independently wealthy Cambridge graduate whose materialistic philosophy was as fixed and immutable as the species of special creation he sought to supplant. So he had a pretty good, pretty high opinion of himself. But this refusal to see past his assumptions would eventually lead his work into question, and we're going to get to that later. 2 years later, in 1858, the Darwin's 10th child, Charles Waring, who had been born with Down syndrome, died of scarlet fever at the age of 1.5. Darwin came to the sobering conclusion that, quote, being married to his first cousin was similar to the inbreeding he studied in plants, which was shown to negatively affect the health and number of resulting offspring. And that must have been really hard for him to swallow. He was again reminded of the importance of his work, but he continued his experiments without going back to write. But later that same year, Wallace composed a letter to Darwin that would alter the course of evolutionary thought. In it, Wallace proposed, in a nutshell, the theory that in a world of competition for physical strength and cunning, teeming with famine, disease, and natural disaster, only the fittest would survive. Wallace had first encountered the idea from another naturalist and believed it to be viable based on his observations, and he actually suggested it to Darwin, who finally saw that his own work was about to be eclipsed, and he sat down and finished that book. Darwin's magnum opus, On the Origin of Species, Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, was released on November 24th, 1859. The first edition run of 1,250 copies sold out immediately, and 300 people placed orders for more of them. And within a week, the publisher, John Murray, was already preparing to publish a second edition of 3,000 copies. The book was reviewed in science journals and in household magazines alike, driving sales among the general public as well as in scientific circles and spurring much debate. Needless to say, it received mixed reviews. The first critic asked, if a monkey can become a man, what may not a man become? He went on to suggest that the answer was best left to theologians because it was too dangerous for ordinary readers to contemplate. And the author was lampooned far and wide in cartoons like this one. Darwin's esteemed colleagues were divided. Some were not ready to have the foundations of their Church of England beliefs shaken, and a few were downright confrontational. When one old man, an elderly, die-hard creationist, had the audacity to ask one of Darwin's most staunch supporters whether he was descended from apes on his grandmother or his grandfather's side, he received a sound and well-deserved rebuke. But even those who agreed in principle with Darwin were prone to argue specific points, sparking debates that are being revived as we speak. And you can see from the date of this caricature that Darwin was fighting the same battle 24 years after the publication of his book. So the question remains, what took Darwin so long to make public the theories that had been so evident to him for such a long time? Now, first, given his upbringing and social standing, Darwin was deeply concerned with appearance, and he was hesitant, if not loath, to upset the status quo, that is, the Church of England and its unswerving belief in special creation and its followers, and even the Crown, which was the head of the church. He likened owning the implications of his lifetime's work to, quote, confessing a murder of English society's most cherished beliefs, beliefs that provided the moral glue holding civil society together, even the murder of God himself. Further, he rather disingenuously, in my humble opinion, presented himself as a man whose faith had held him back from publishing his findings, when the truth was that it was Emma's faith that he did not want to compromise. The other reason for his hesitation, though, was that Darwin had begun his work not with a hypothesis, but a rather admittedly brilliant assumption, a fixed conviction in the truth of a materialistic philosophy in natural science, and that's how he described his work. In other words, he went out into the world to find the evidence that supported his theory. That's not the scientific method. Wallace crafted his theory from extended expeditions into uncharted territory and long sojourns with native cultures, making observations and gathering thousands of specimens to bring home and study further. Darwin, however, looked for what he wanted to find on mostly short stopovers wherever the beagle was stopping to do its own work, making observation and collecting whatever specimens were available that bolstered what he already believed. At the time of the publication of Origin, Wallace was still in the Malay archipelago, and by the time he returned to England 3 years later, he brought back an astonishing haul of 125,000 specimens. 83,000 beetles, 13,000 butterflies, 8,000 birds, 7,500 shells, and 400 animals, a few of them actually still alive. And he published his own 2-volume set of books on his findings, Wallace's Malay Archipelago, Volumes 1 and 2, which you can see over on the right-hand side of the slide. And he was able to lecture and was finally inducted into professional societies that previously had looked down on him as too amateur for their notice. But Wallace began to deviate from the accepted purview of special scientists, his fellow scientists. First, he became interested in comparative ethnology, or the study of the nature of man. This topic Darwin assiduously avoided. Wallace also became involved with spiritualism and began attending seances. Hang on. He was not the only scientist to do so. Others included well-known physicists, mathematicians, logicians, and philosophers, including William James, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience. Skeptics dismissed Wallace on the grounds that belief in the so-called supernatural required the suspension of natural law, but Wallace and many others believed that these kinds of experiences could be explained by a yet undiscovered natural law. It was a serious rift between Wallace and Darwin, who had corresponded fairly regularly for the past decade and had maintained an attitude of mutual respect, although it was an uneasy one on Darwin's part. But then Wallace changed his mind about natural selection. In a lecture he delivered at his last public appearance in 1909, he declared that the only way he could account for the beauty of butterfly wings was to acknowledge, quote, some guiding power, some supreme mind directing and organizing the blind forces of nature in the production of this marvelous development of life and loveliness. And he repeated this assertion in his last book, which would also be his most widely read book, called The World of Life, the following year. He called his theory overruling intelligence, which sounds a lot like infinite intelligence to me. It was an intriguing hypothesis that caused him to lose much of the respect that he has worked so diligently to earn from his contemporaries, and all I could imagine was Darwin must have been spinning in his grave. The only concession Darwin was ever willing to make to public sentiment was included in a new edition of Origins, released just 6 weeks after the book's first publication, where he added the phrase, by the Creator, to his observation, there is grandeur in this, read Darwin's view of life, with its several powers having originally been breathed into new forms by the Creator. But he soon backpedaled, writing to a colleague that, quote, he had truckled to public opinion and used the word creation by which he had really meant appeared by some wholly unknown process. But he failed to delete the 3 words from 4 more editions. And one biographer wrote, the only conceivable answer is that Darwin preferred the public relations advantage that such truckling offered. Origin has been called arguably the most influential academic book in history. It's never been out of print. The first edition copy recently sold for $174,000, and an autographed first edition went for $350,000. Darwin published 20 books and more than 200 articles, and his papers are preserved in the Charles Darwin Papers and Charles Darwin Library collections at the Cambridge University Library. And his specimens are found in Kew Gardens and the ornithology collections of the Museum of Natural History. And there's also a Darwin research station on the Galapagos Islands. So Darwin died in 1882 at the age of 73. I could only find 2 references that Baba made to Darwin. One took place on the evening of Thursday, December 27th, 1927, during his lecture to the Meher Ashram boys at the Crypt Cabin. Quote, reference was made here. Now this has been written by whoever was transcribing Baba's alphabet board. Reference was made here after Baba finished talking about the animal kingdom to the speculations of Darwin, which he said are mere theories, though cleverly thought out. Yet the explanations given here in these lectures are of things actually seen. And a note at the bottom of the page, I assume which was written by Ward, reads, quote, Baba seems to be referring here not to empirical observation, but to the immediate inner sight that is gnosis. That is, the evolutionary process that he has been describing is known directly through the knowledge of a seer. So, you know, what we thought were 2 complementary explanations, in other words, Darwin's explanation, which mirrors Baba's explanation very closely, but Baba was coming from a completely different perspective. Alfred Russel Wallace produced 22 books and nearly 750 shorter pieces, 500 of which were scientific papers. He was a prolific writer. And the Malay Archipelago became one of the most popular books of scientific exploration in the 19th century, and it has never been out of print. He also left notebooks, diaries, and correspondence, which are preserved by the Linnean Society in London, and his specimens are held in 37 institutions in 27 countries around the world. He died in 1913 at the age of 90, having overlapped Baba's life by 19 years. How are we doing for time? I have no, is it up here? 2:54. Okay, I think we're still good. Evolutionary theory faced a rocky road in America. And I think you all probably are familiar with the story of the Scopes monkey trials in July of 1925, when Tennessee teacher John Scopes was prosecuted for teaching evolution to his high school students in defiance of the Tennessee Butler Act passed in March of that year, which forbade the teaching of human evolution in public schools. So we've done a complete turnaround from not wanting to talk about evolution to evolution being the only story. And he incriminated himself in order to bring attention to the unconstitutionality of the act. He was found guilty and fined $100, but the verdict was overturned because of a technicality. But the trial brought national attention in the United States to the controversy that was ignited by Origin of the Species, and it only intensified a debate that continues to rage. It inspired the powerful 1925 play and 1960 movie called Inherit the Wind. And I looked in Mahara Meher, and Baba and the women did not ever see that movie. I was very curious.
July 10th, 1920.
Well, July 10th was the end. It went on between the 5th and the 10th.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I didn't mention that. Let me get some water here. In the 1930s, another religious movement emerged, members of which called themselves young earth creationists. They, like the generations of evangelical Christians who came before, believed that the world was created literally as the Bible says it was, and that God, being God, could supernaturally circumvent all the known laws of science to do so. Jewish and Christian creationists believe that the world is only 6,000 years old, based on genealogy in the first books of the Bible, although some will acknowledge that it could perhaps be as many as 12,000 years old. Gap theory, which cracks me up, concedes that the universe, Earth, and solar system may well be millions or even billions of years old, but insists that God created our world 6,000 years ago in 6 24-hour days by divine decree. So I don't know how you get to that place. There's a man in Williamsburg, Kentucky, who spent $100 million constructing an ark according to the specifications in the Bible. And he's turned it into a theme park called Ark Encounter that actually gets tax breaks from the state. The boat is 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet high. And the park's website calls it, of course they do, a modern engineering marvel. Among the recreated creatures on the ark are dinosaurs, which are confined to wooden enclosures. It's a little hard to imagine. About 1 million people visit the park annually, though, so it is appealing to a lot of people. Meanwhile, Gallup polls from 2017 and 2019 found that 40% of Americans still believe that the Earth is no older than 10,000 years, which is really kind of scary. Darwin left no room for God in his theories, and over time Wallace's work was subsumed by what was seen as Darwin's more monumental achievement, which is why you'd probably never heard of him before today. And this is why we have this ongoing tug of war between science and religion that asserts that the truth must be in possession of one or the other, and there's no middle ground. But there is, and some contemporary evolutionary scientists are now embracing Wallace's theory of an overriding intelligence, further opening the door to a recognition of what Baba called infinite intelligence. Sadly, one modern movement called intelligent design has co-opted the theory of an overriding intelligence for its own purposes. Although it endeavors to present itself as a scientific school of thought, it's described, quote, as a neo-creationist movement promoting a pseudo-scientific argument for the existence of God, presented by its proponents as an evidence-based scientific theory about life's origins. There's an organization called the Discovery Institute. It's sponsored by a conservative Christian think tank that's established its own Center for Science and Culture, which is a very misleading name for an organization that clearly has an unspoken agenda promoting a veiled form of creationism. In 2006, the state of Ohio ruled that intelligent design could not be taught in the classroom because it hinted at the possibility of a creator God. And school systems continue to decline to teach it. Intelligent design theory, as benign and hopeful as it sounds, has only muddied the waters and made it that much more difficult to imagine breaching the battle lines between science and religion. And it's becoming clear that only Meher Baba will be able to accomplish that. Teleonomy, the theory that evolution is driven internally rather than externally is one of the newest ideas being explored. It goes to great lengths to explain evolution by bypassing the notion of any kind of external infinite intelligence. But what drives this internal mechanism? Baba tells us it's consciousness. Teleonomy is also, and this is a quote from a new book that's been published, teleonomy is also an implicit, though unspoken, influence on the recent concept of agency in evolution, suggesting the role of purposeful behavior. A radically different view of evolution has been emerging in this century. We now know that living systems actively shape their own evolution in various ways. In my peregrinations on the internet, I found a children's site about evolution that refers to its hero as Granddaddy Darwin. But now even Darwin's explanations of evolution are being re-examined. Some scientists are questioning the assertion that evolution is driven by competition or survival of the fittest. Mounting evidence supports the theory that it's the cooperation of species working together to support mutual survival that allows whole networks of species to thrive and evolve. Baba gave us the mechanism for evolution, consciousness, as well as some rather esoteric explanations of the process. And in our next meeting, we'll explore the way that science supports and enhances and even occasionally contradicts his explanations. Or maybe Baba contradicts theirs, I'm not sure which. It'll be really different from this meeting. It's going to be very interactive and a lot of fun as we try to bring the process of evolution to life.
Susan, how did you find the author of this?
That just, I sent out an email and several people got back to me that was her name.
Oh.
And you know, it appeared at just the right moment. I looked at it and I'm like, oh my God, that's Baba, the creator. It was such a perfect addition to the, or way to conclude the talk. I'm sorry, I yammered on for a long time, and I didn't tell you all that you were welcome to ask questions, but you were, now that it's too late. So if you have any questions or thoughts, we will endeavor to entertain them. Wilson.
It seems that I remember that there was someone that was a contemporary of Darwin's in Russia that
Oh,
was actually working on the theory of cooperation.
really?
And he was, of course, Darwin won the day. Do you know his name? Or
I
does anyone
don't.
else know his
I
name?
didn't run across
It
that.
Probably could be Googled, but
Yeah.
he was a contemporary, and he just, you know, his emphasis was on cooperation rather than the
wow.
survival of the fittest.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't run across that. I'll have to look him up.
He's Russian.
Russian, okay. Other thoughts or questions? I had a couple of questions that I just want to throw out. Why is science so resistant to the idea of God? Why do you think science pushes the idea of God away? Why can't scientists have a creator that made all these wonderful things for them to study?
They're not evolved enough.
Well, I thought about that. Okay, go
I
ahead.
think that science worked very hard to be what they thought was unbiased at
Yes.
the time.
Yes.
And the whole idea of empirical study
Yes.
really that was a long thing in the making to get the church out of it.
Yeah,
and
true.
all of that stuff and develop the science. And now it is very hard, you know, I've heard people say science progresses one death at a time, because once you have a theory and you hold on to it, then you know, it takes
You get
a
stuck.
lot to change that.
Yeah.
And, but, you know, I think it will change.
I think so too. It has to.
Yeah,
Evie.
I mean, the thing that I'm struck by is how dangerous ideas are. Right?
Yes.
So science can't tolerate the idea of a higher presence or
Mhm.
divine presence.
Mhm.
And creationists can't tolerate the idea that, you know, we sprang up through a whole evolutionary process.
Yeah, I
And that
think.
there's, you know, this kind of, yeah,
Yeah.
combat.
I think also, as science delves deeper and deeper into the nature of reality with ever increasing, ever sensitive instruments
Mhm.
capable of making observations, they are increasingly running up against the fact that they have to give over to something that is not observable
Yes.
in order to explain the nature of reality.
That's really true because the technology has become so sensitive, and yet it only allows them to go so far. And they're proposing that things exist that they can't see, that they can't measure, they can't prove they exist, except that they are the things that they can see imply that there's something smaller that comes after, but they can't measure it in any way.
I have a brother-in-law who had a very scientific mind. He wasn't trained scientifically, but he claimed to be an atheist. When he would talk, and I don't know if this is anybody else, but when he would talk about God in the sky, this person.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always thought, he has never studied what God is, so
Mhm.
he doesn't have anything. He just has some childhood
Yeah,
idea of what
yeah.
God is. And so I don't know if that's others, but if they had studied God, I just think they've never studied what God is.
Mm.
And maybe they
It's interesting.
think of it as a person. And
Mhm.
this old man in the sky. I'm like, God is not an old man in the sky.
Yeah.
And so I found other people, speaking of other people who claim to be atheists, especially,
Mhm.
I'm not talking about scientists, have this type of idea.
Mhm.
I don't know if there's any kind of connection in that at all. I don't know.
Yeah, they don't do the work. They've
They don't-
already
they work on the
decided.
spiritual side, they
Yeah,
work on the
yeah.
scientific side.
And there's such a difference between religion and spirituality. I think there are a lot of people who are holding the middle ground between science and religion. They can hold both of those things. You know, they can imagine a creator that made a universe that started 84 billion or 8.4 billion years ago. They can do that. And I think there are a good many of us, but nobody asks us what we think. You know, the people in the middle are the ones who aren't listened to very much. People who get all the attention are the extremes, like Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary scientist. I just can't abide him. He is, sorry, Baba, he is just obnoxious and officious, and he will not tolerate any kind of any level of questioning of his ideas of what evolution means. I mean, he's so rigid, it's unbelievable. And on the other end, you've got this crazy man in Kentucky with more money than sense who's built the ark, you know, and they're the ones who get all the attention, unfortunately.
In your upcoming classes, parts of this series.
Yeah, let's not call them classes.
Right. See,
Although this felt like a
you're
class.
presenting, Darwin is presenting the evolution of form,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
But us as Bible lovers, we know that it's the evolution of consciousness.
Right, right. And we'll look at how those things, you know, how when evolution, how evolution just doesn't understand the place of consciousness, and so their explanations fall short. We know what's going on is the growing consciousness of the forms, and so we'll look at how those two things kind of.
Have you found anyone who is leaning towards, evolution of consciousness? Is there anyone out there besides Mayor Baba?
A little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've read, in the last couple of years, articles. Two things science doesn't understand: consciousness and gravity. Two big mysteries. Well, they admit it, but there have been some, recently, I couldn't tell you who, scientists who have been talking about the evolution of consciousness and saying that some say now that animals have consciousness, and some brave ones are going back to plants. They haven't got to metals and rocks, of course, but even plants have consciousness.
Yeah.
And that's like a breakthrough.
It's a paradigm shift
Yeah.
in science. Yeah, what was I just going to
There's also
say?
that, Japanese scientist that measures the reaction of water
Yeah.
to emotional states.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yeah.
There seems to be some kind of a link between consciousness or some form of consciousness and water molecules.
Yeah, the thing is, science is locked into this idea that the brain is an electrical appliance, and when you die, the appliance dies with it, and it generates and your heart generate the electricity, if you will, that keep our bodies functioning. And when it's the other way around. They can't get past the idea of the brain as an organ, as the generator of the mind. They can't imagine a mind that comes before the brain.
I don't think it works to say science versus spirituality, because scientific people, all right, also love. And love is spiritual. So, all right, perhaps science and religion, all right, aspects of duality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's a process.
Yeah, exactly. It's a continuum. It's a continuum. One of the, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just want to mention that there are some scientists who are major outliers, okay, to this discussion. There's a guy named Donald Hoffman, who's a physicist, but he's also an evolutionary biologist. And his theory is fascinating and not at all standard. And among other things, he talks about his conclusion as a result of the math as a physicist, because that's their language, is that this is all a creation of conscious agents.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And there's another guy who is very much materialist, who's very much within the norms of the scientific community as materialist. But he believes that everything is intelligence. So there's a lot of edges that people are talking about, but they only go so far.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that occurred to me as I was thinking about this was how Baba said that he had brought scientists here from other planets to help us to evolve. And he also talked about some of those planets where he said some of them are 100% intelligence, no heart whatsoever, and this is the only planet where you can attain a balance of the head and heart. And I thought, what would that be like to have evolved on a planet where there was no such thing as love or God, and suddenly to be dropped in here, you would have no context for it, nothing in your unconscious mind. It would be completely foreign to you. So I don't know, it's kind of an out there theory, but I did think about it,
Yeah, but those people have past lives too. And so
Yes.
they've got those scars of previous lifetimes. They may have only spent one lifetime on
Yeah,
the planet.
exactly, exactly. Tony.
At one time in my life, I worked in the computer science lab at Carnegie Mellon University in the 1970s. And I was actually dealing with hardware, computer hardware. And some of the students, they were utterly brilliant. And I was just positive that they were from another planet. They loved science fiction. They were very drawn to everything the same. but they also love to do outdoor things like hiking, things like
Interesting.
yeah, I mean, there was just a couple of them that just struck, and very logic, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
And a lot of them, some of them even left before they got their degrees because they just went off and started other companies
Wow.
in terms of the cyber world. And they were starting to do robotics back then.
Yeah. Wow.
But that was my theory. I really enjoyed them. But
Yeah, I've met people that I think came from another planet on their previous life. I have met a few. Wilson.
I'm really interested in this because I'm interested in where this whole idea of duality came from, because we live in it like fish in water and we don't even question whether or not it's true. But there's quite a lot of evidence that it isn't true, that you can go to extremes, and if you hold both of those extremes equally, they disappear. The problem is we tend to identify with a particular extreme and think it's the whole truth. So we have to open ourselves mentally, longingly, what our hearts desire, and bodily. That openness means that we relax, that we just relax, are not clinging on to things.
Yeah.
And to me, that is the, there was a guy by the name of Paul Harvey, a number of years ago.
Oh, yeah.
He was very conservative.
Oh, yeah.
But he'd always take something that was very interesting. He was very conservative, and he'd say, now the rest of the story.
Yeah.
And he'd give another side to it. So he's like,
Interesting.
wow, this is, yeah. Even though he had a very kind of more narrow way.
Go ahead.
Baba said that when there are two sides, neither side has the whole truth.
Yeah.
actually, my Baba contact came from Carnegie Mellon University.
Wow.
It's in the computer science.
That's amazing. Any other thoughts or questions or revelations?
I'm just thinking of Einstein, he had such a spiritual side and he had a huge brain. To a scientist, God is a mathematical equation that is figured out. And, and there's something to that. There's definitely something to that, a mathematical equation that they figure out. I mean, this can happen and whatever this is. And I don't know, I feel like science holds that mysterious key.
But toward the end of his life, he was looking for a unified theory, which he never was able to develop.
Right.
Yeah.
And that unified theory is in the Avatar.
Right.
It's all there in the Avatar. We don't need anything else.
Yeah, Einstein said that he was probably an atheist, but he was willing to change. If someone could just show him something that would convince him otherwise. Stephen Hawking, was flat out an atheist, but he would invoke the name of God as a metaphor in a lot of his talks, which was really very strange. But he always said that he wasn't talking about the God that we all it was the God that everybody else believes in, but a God that doesn't exist. It was just a way for him to express a thought that he wanted to. I thought that was really strange.
Einstein was not 100% in that book that you just described. I read a letter that was written by Einstein to somebody that taught me in college. And he said in that letter that he was looking for God, that there were certain questions.
Wow.
And he felt like he was a whale floating through the universe looking.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so there's a poetic and a very different kind of hidden side
Yeah.
that would have been a private side.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the thing is that, Stephen Hawking was looking for a theory of everything and didn't find it. He was looking the wrong way. But we know where it is. Other thoughts or comments or revelations? Well, I want to thank you for sitting through my talk because it... Oh, thank you. I hope it wasn't tedious, but I really felt like it was important for us to understand how this interplay of science and religion brought us to the place where we are now. But next time it's going to be very interactive and fun, and there are going to be animals. I won't say any more than that, but I think we'll have a good time the next time. It will be totally different from this.
Where and when?
Here on, what's the next date?
June 2nd.
June the 2nd. It's about 4 weeks away. I tried to keep them 4 weeks apart so I could regain my sanity before I had to do another one.
And the slides were beautiful.
Thank you. I had a good time putting them together.